Guys, it's Alex. Welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to walk through a chapter of American history that most of us only encountered as a sanitized paragraph in a school textbook, if we encountered it at all. We're talking about the genocide of indigenous people in the Americas and the real historical figure behind the mythology of Christopher Columbus. And just to be clear at the start, this isn't a political exercise. This isn't about guilt-tripping modern people. This is about accuracy. It's about correcting the record that was deliberately cleaned up for mass consumption. Because the version of the story most of us learned, the intrepid explorer who discovered an empty land, is not history, it's national folklore. And folklore, while comforting, is rarely honest. So let's take the folklore apart and replace it with the truth. Before Europeans ever arrived, the Americas were not empty, wild, or undeveloped. They were home to an astonishing diversity of nations, languages, and political systems, many more than Europe at the same time. Historians estimate 50 to 100 million indigenous people lived across the hemisphere. North America alone contained over 500 distinct nations, each with its own culture, governance, technology, and ecological expertise. This included the city-building Mississippian societies, the Iroquois Confederacy with a sophisticated constitutional system, the agricultural civilizations of the Southwest, the Great Plains trading networks, and advanced societies stretching from the Arctic to the Amazon. The idea that Europeans brought civilization to an empty wilderness is not only historically false, it's the foundation of the colonial worldview that justified everything that came next. Now let's turn to Christopher Columbus, a man whose historical reputation has drifted so far from reality that the two barely resemble each other. First, the obvious corrections. Columbus did not discover America. He never set foot in what is now the United States. Indigenous people had been here for tens of thousands of years, and for the record, the Vikings reached the continent centuries earlier. What Columbus did do was land in the Caribbean, and immediately begin the process of colonization by force. This isn't interpretation. Columbus kept journals. In those journals, he described the Taino people as, they would make fine servants, while with 50 men, we could subjugate them and make them do whatever we wish. He wrote that on day one. The blueprint was clear. Columbus was appointed governor of those new territories. Accounts from both Spanish settlers and indigenous survivors describe a regime of enslavement, forced labor, mutilation, and brutality. And here's the remarkable part. Columbus's government was so violent that he was eventually arrested by the Spanish crown and shipped back to Europe in chains. Because even by the standards of a 15th century empire, his treatment of indigenous people was indefensible. When a colonial empire famous for conquest tells you you've gone too far, that's a useful benchmark of just how extreme your actions were. Columbus set in motion one of the most catastrophic population collapses in human history. On the islands of Hispaniola alone, the Taino population declined from hundreds of thousands to a few thousands within a generation. Disease played a major role, yes, but disease was not an isolated event. Disease spread in environments created by enslavement, starvation, forced relocations, the destruction of food systems, and violent social disruption. This was not a natural disaster, it was the predictable consequence of colonial domination. As Spanish, English, French, Dutch, and Portuguese powers expanded into the Americas, they brought them with the same logic Columbus established: extract resources, eliminate resistance, make the continent in the image of Europe. This meant the burning of villages, the seizure of fertile land, the enslavement of indigenous labor, forced religious conversion, military campaigns against entire nations, and in many documented cases, intentional extermination. These actions weren't accidents or misunderstandings, they were strategies. Fast forward to the early United States, a nation built on ideals of liberty, while simultaneously enacting policies that removed, confined, and destroyed indigenous nations. President Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act authorized the forced relocation of indigenous nations from their homelands to designated Indian Territory. This resulted in the Trail of Tears, a series of death marches that killed thousands. Entire nations were uprooted not because they posed a military threat, but because their land was valuable. Several states created bounty systems that paid settlers for killing indigenous people, including women and children. This wasn't frontier chaos, it was government policy. The reservation system confined indigenous nations to isolated, often agriculturally poor regions. These lands were chosen not to preserve indigenous life, but to contain it. And now we arrive at a policy that targeted the very core of indigenous survival. Children in the U.S. didn't only want indigenous lands, it wanted indigenous identity erased. This is where the boarding school systems enter. The system's intellectual architect was Richard Henry Pratt, founder of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. He articulated the mission clearly: kill the Indian, save the man. This meant eliminating indigenous languages, religions, values, governance systems, and worldviews, everything that sustained a people. Children were taken from their families through coercion, threats, or outright abduction. Parents who resisted risked imprisonment or the loss of government rations that were often the only food source after their land had been seized. Upon arrival at a boarding school, a child's transformation began immediately. Their hair was cut, their traditional clothing removed, their language prohibited, their names replaced with English ones, their ceremonies outlawed. This wasn't assimilation, it was cultural demolition. These institutions claimed to educate, but most of the children's time was spent in grueling labor: farming, carpentry, laundering, industrial work. The schools profited where the children endured. Speaking an indigenous language was punished. Practicing a ceremony was punished. Expressing identity was punished. The goal wasn't to produce well-rounded American citizens. It was to sever the intergenerational transmission of culture. Thousands of children died in these schools from disease, malnutrition, abuse, and neglect. Many were buried in unmarked graves that are still being located today. This was a form of genocide aimed at the continuity of indigenous nations. Culture is inherited through language, stories, ceremonies, kinship. Remove children from that environment and you disrupt the survival of the culture itself. Why this is genocide? Under UN definitions, genocide includes not only killing members of a group, but also causing physical or mental harm, imposing destructive living conditions, preventing birth, and forcibly transferring children. The entire colonial project, from Columbus to the boarding schools, meets multiple criteria. The legacy of the history lives on today in disparities in health, land rights, education, economic opportunity, and the ongoing crisis of missing and murdered indigenous women. History is not past, its consequences shape the present. Columbus didn't become a national hero until the late 1800s, when Italian Americans facing discrimination sought a positive cultural figure to rally around. Politicians embraced the idea. Textbooks followed. The myth solidified. Columbus became a symbol, not because his actions deserved it, but because a growing nation wanted a simple origin story. The truth is simple. Columbus was not a hero. The settlement of the Americas was not peaceful, and the treatment of indigenous people was not an unfortunate mistake. It was colonization. It was intentional violence. It was cultural and physical genocide. And acknowledging that doesn't weaken the United States, it strengthens it, because nations, like people, can only grow when they confront their past honestly. Indigenous peoples are not relics. They are living nations with vibrant cultures, language, and sovereignty. They survived centuries of policies designed to erase them. That resilience alone deserves more recognition than any myth ever created about Columbus. The least we can do, the absolute minimum, is tell the truth.